The brown stallion charged through smoke and thunder, his hooves pounding against earth that had forgotten the taste of peace, carrying a rider who would soon change everything simply by letting go. Kahar had known nothing but war for so long that the rhythm of artillery fire had become his heartbeat, the smell of gunpowder his morning air. His coat, once the rich brown of autumn leaves, now carried the gray dust of 100 battles. The white blaze down his face remained his one claim to beauty in a world that had forgotten such things existed. The battlefield stretched endless and hungry around them. Men shouted orders that meant nothing. Cannons roared their ancient songs of destruction. Horses screamed and fell, and rose again, and fell once more. Kahar had learned to step carefully around the fallen, to keep moving when everything inside him wanted to stop and mourn. His rider sat steady above him, hands gentle on the reins despite the chaos. They had become something together over these months of shared terror, horse and man moving as one creature through hell itself. The man never pulled too hard, never asked for more than Kahar could give. In return, Kahar carried him through situations that would have broken lesser partnerships. Then came the bullet that changed everything. It found its mark with the casual precision that war specializes in. One moment his rider was there, solid and familiar, guiding them through another charge. The next moment, there was only weight without purpose. Hands that no longer held anything, knees that pressed against his sides but communicated nothing but stillness. Kahar felt the shift like a door opening inside his chest. The reins that had guided him suddenly felt foreign. The bit in his mouth tasted of metal and servitude. Every muscle in his body remembered what it meant to choose his own direction, to run for reasons that belonged to him alone. He stopped in the middle of the battlefield, artillery screaming overhead, and something wild and forgotten stirred in his blood. The leather that bound him to duty snapped like dry branches. The saddle that had been his platform became just weight he no longer needed to carry. When he ran, it was not the controlled gallop of cavalry charge, but something older, deeper. His hooves found their own rhythm now, drumming out a song of liberation that echoed across the broken ground. Behind him the war continued without pause. Men and horses locked in their dance of destruction, but Ka was no longer part of their choreography. His body bore the scars of service, thin lines across his flanks where shrapnel had kissed him, marks on his legs from debris and chaos. But as he ran, these wounds transformed from badges of bondage into proof of survival, evidence that something in him had remained unbroken through it all. The horizon ahead promised nothing except uncertainty. But uncertainty felt like luxury after months of knowing exactly what each day would bring. For the first time since his youth, Kahar ran toward mystery instead of away from death, his powerful legs carrying him into a future that belonged entirely to him. The thunder of hooves became the thunder of hope, echoing across a landscape that had forgotten such sounds were possible. Sometimes the greatest distances are measured not in miles but in the slow dissolution of everything familiar. As the brown stallion discovered when the world began to empty itself around him like water draining from a broken vessel, days blurred into one endless march across terrain that seemed determined to erase every memory of gentleness from the earth. Kahar's hooves, once sure on cobblestone and meadowgrass, now sank into sand that shifted like liquid beneath his weight. The green fields of his youth had become ghosts, replaced by an ocean of golden dunes that stretched beyond comprehension. His coat told the story of this transformation. The rich brown that had once caught sunlight like polished wood now wore a patina of dust and grit. Sand worked its way into every crevice between his ears, around his eyes, settling into the very texture of his being, until he became part of the landscape itself. Only the white blaze down his face remained unchanged, a stark reminder of who he had been, now serving as his sole beacon of identity in this monotonous vastness. The silence here possessed a weight that pressed against his chest with each breath. After months of constant noise, constant human voices, and mechanical sounds, this absolute quiet, felt almost violent in its completeness. His own breathing became thunderous. The whisper of sand against his legs sounded like conversations in a language he would never understand. Water haunted his thoughts with increasing desperation. His tongue had begun to feel foreign in his mouth, thick and unwieldy. The memory of cool streams from his homeland played tricks on his mind, appearing as shimmering mirages that dissolved the moment he approached. Every hollow between dunes promised relief that never materialized. Every shadow suggested moisture that existed only in his imagination. The psychological weight of solitude pressed down heavier than any rider ever had. Kahar had spent his entire life surrounded by the constant presence of others. First in the peaceful fields where humans moved among the horses with gentle purpose, then in the structured chaos of military life where even terror was shared. Now he faced something far more challenging than battle: the absolute responsibility of his own survival in a world that seemed designed to swallow him whole. His legs carried him forward, not from hope but from habit. Each step a negotiation between his body's growing weakness and his spirit's stubborn refusal to surrender. The scars from war seemed insignificant now compared to this new kind of suffering, this slow grinding away of everything he had once taken for granted. As another day dissolved into the heat shimmer of afternoon, Kahar understood that the desert was teaching him something about endurance that no battlefield ever could. Here, survival was not about explosive moments of courage, but about the quiet persistence of continuing to breathe, to step, to believe that somewhere beyond the next dune lay something other than more sand. The vastness around him offered no promises, no comfort, no companionship. It simply existed, patient and eternal, waiting to see what remained of the horse who had chosen freedom over security, who had traded the known horror of war for the unknown challenge of surviving completely alone. Sometimes hope reveals itself as the cruelest magician of all, offering salvation with one hand while preparing devastation with the other, as the brown stallion learned when the desert finally answered his prayers with an empty promise carved from ancient stone. The well appeared like a miracle, rising from the endless sand, its weathered stones darkened by centuries of desert storms, yet still proud against the bleached landscape. Kahar's heart hammered against his ribs as he stumbled toward it, his legs trembling with more than exhaustion. Here was the answer to every desperate prayer his body had whispered into the wind, the end to the torment that had transformed each swallow into agony. His hooves clattered against stone, worn smooth by countless hands that had once drawn life from these depths. The sound echoed with promise, with the ghost memory of water splashing against bucket and rope. He pressed his muzzle to the rim, breathing in the cool air that rose from below, tasting moisture that seemed to dance just beyond reach. Then he looked down into darkness that stared back with the hollow gaze of abandonment. The shaft descended into shadows that held nothing but dust and broken dreams. Stone walls that had once wept with precious seepage now stood dry as bone, scarred by the slow retreat of water that had fled decades ago, perhaps longer. The bucket and rope lay rotted at the bottom, testament to hope that had died so long ago it had turned to archaeology. Kahar's legs gave way then, and he sank beside the well like a supplicant before an altar that had forgotten how to grant miracles. The crushing weight of disappointment pressed against his chest, making each breath feel like swallowing sand. This was worse than simple thirst, worse than the honest suffering of the empty desert. This was betrayal written in stone and shadow. His mind fled to memories of abundance, of the gentle streams that had once meandered through green pastures, where he had drunk his fill without thought. He remembered the sound of water moving over smooth stones, the way it caught sunlight and scattered it like liquid diamonds. Most painful of all, he recalled the human hands that had once carried buckets to his trough, the careful attention of those who had made his comfort their responsibility. Those memories felt like artifacts from another creature's life now. The horse who had trusted in human kindness, who had expected care as his natural right, seemed as distant as the water that had once filled this well. In this moment of absolute abandonment, Kahar understood that his escape from war had led him not to freedom, but to a different kind of battlefield. One where the enemy was not bullets or artillery, but the vast indifference of a world that owed him nothing. The sun continued its merciless arc overhead, and the well continued its patient silence. Somewhere in the depths of his despair, Kahar felt something harder than hope beginning to crystallize, something that tasted of salt and determination rather than sweet promises. The desert had shown him its cruelest trick, but he was still breathing, still capable of rising from beside this monument to broken expectations. The well would remain empty, but perhaps that emptiness could teach him something about the difference between what he wanted and what he might yet find the strength to seek. In the deepest silence, a soul discovers whether it carries the seeds of its own companionship, or will wither in the terrible freedom of absolute solitude. As the brown stallion learned when the desert's quiet became louder than any battle he had ever known. The sun hung like a merciless eye in the bleached sky, its heat pressing down with the weight of judgment. Kahar stood motionless beside the empty well, feeling the profound silence settle around him like burial shrouds. Here in this vast cathedral of sand and stone, every sound became amplified into something almost sacred. His own breathing echoed like wind through empty chambers. The whisper of sand shifting across dunes spoke in languages older than memory. Somewhere in the blue distance, a hawk's cry pierced the air with such clarity it seemed to come from inside his own chest. The scars that mapped his body began to throb with renewed intensity, as if the silence had awakened every sleeping pain. Each mark told its story in pulses that matched his heartbeat. The long line across his shoulder from shrapnel whispered of explosions he had survived. The smaller nicks from flying debris spoke of chaos navigated, of terror transformed into forward motion. These wounds had been earned in service to purposes he had never chosen, battles fought for reasons that had died with his rider. Now in this crushing quiet, those scars felt like questions carved into his flesh. What was he, if not a war horse? What purpose did his strength serve if not to carry others into conflict? The realization crept through him, like cold water, that he existed in a space between worlds, belonging fully to none. He was not wild, having known too much of human intention and care. Yet he was no longer domesticated, having tasted the bitter freedom of choice. He was not at war, but neither was he at peace. The silence invited him to examine the architecture of his own identity, and what he found there troubled him. His entire sense of self had been built around relationship, around the needs and expectations of others. As a young horse, he had been the promising colt who would grow strong. As a trained mount, he had been the reliable partner who would not fail. As a cavalry horse, he had been the weapon that would not break. But here, with no one to serve and nothing to prove, who was he? The desert offered no answers, only the patient persistence of its own existence. It had been here long before horses learned to carry riders, and it would remain long after such partnerships became legends. Its silence was not empty but full, pregnant with the weight of everything that had ever lived and died beneath its watching sky. Kahar's legs trembled, not from exhaustion now but from the vertigo of facing himself without the comfortable distraction of duty. In this moment of absolute solitude, he began to understand that his escape from war had been only the first step in a longer journey. The real challenge was not surviving the desert's physical trials, but discovering what remained of himself when stripped of every external definition. The hawk cried again, distant and free, and something in that sound suggested that identity might be less about what one serves and more about what one chooses to become. When no one is watching, memory becomes both sanctuary and torment. When the mind, stripped of present comfort, reaches backward through time like fingers grasping for water. As the brown stallion discovered when delirium opened doors he had long kept sealed against the weight of what he had lost. The heat pressed against Kahar's consciousness, like a fever, blurring the boundaries between past and present, until moments from his life began to surface. With startling clarity, first came the meadows of his birth, green as emeralds and soft as whispered promises. He could feel the cool grass beneath his hooves again, taste the sweetness of morning dew, hear the gentle lowing of cattle in distant fields. His mother's warm breath against his neck returned to him with such vividness that he turned his head, expecting to find her there beside the empty well. Then came the memories of training, and with them, a face that had defined years of his existence. The young soldier had possessed hands that spoke fluency in patience, fingers that communicated trust rather than dominance. His touch had been firm but never harsh, guiding rather than forcing, as if he understood that true partnership required invitation rather than compulsion. They had spent hours together in the practice fields, learning each other's rhythms, developing a language that transcended the barrier between species. The soldier's voice echoed across the desert now, calling Kahar by name, not as a possession, but as a friend. In those early days, before the machinery of war had claimed them both, there had been laughter in that voice, joy in their shared accomplishments. The man would bring apples from his own rations, would speak to Kahar of letters from home, of a sister who tended gardens, and a mother who worried about sons, sent to places where kindness became a luxury few could afford. These memories arrived like cool water in the furnace of his present suffering, offering temporary relief that somehow made the thirst more unbearable. The contrast between past abundance and present emptiness carved new wounds in his spirit. He remembered streams where he had drunk without thought, the simple pleasure of water moving over his tongue, the satisfaction of thirst easily quenched. Now those memories mocked him with their easy generosity. Most painful of all were the recollections of trust. The way his rider had leaned forward before difficult passages, sharing his weight as if to say they would face whatever came together. The gentle pressure of knees that communicated direction without demanding submission. The morning ritual of grooming that had been less about maintenance than about communion, two beings acknowledging their mutual dependence with quiet reverence. War had slowly poisoned that trust, replacing tenderness with urgency, patience with desperate efficiency. The young soldier's face had hardened, season by season, carved into new shapes by the weight of witnessing too much, until the man who fell from Kahar's back in that final battle bore only passing resemblance to the youth who had once shared apples and whispered dreams. Yet even transformed by conflict, even silenced forever, that bond had remained unbroken. It lived now in the desert silence, in the space between memory and longing, a testament to connections that transcend circumstance and endure beyond the grave. The gentleness that war had buried still pulsed beneath Kahar's warrior exterior, a persistent rhythm of compassion that no amount of suffering could completely silence. The moment arrives when every creature must choose between the seductive embrace of surrender and the brutal honesty of one more step forward, though what compels that choice often remains as mysterious as the desert wind that carries both destruction and the seeds of distant blooms. Kahar's body had become a catalog of failing systems, each function a negotiation between what remained possible and what had already been lost. His legs trembled with each step, no longer the powerful pistons that had carried him through countless charges, but fragile scaffolding, threatening collapse. The sand beneath his hooves felt increasingly distant, as if the earth itself was receding from his touch. Thirst had evolved beyond physical sensation into something approaching madness. His tongue had swollen, until swallowing became an act of will rather than instinct. The saliva that should have eased his suffering had abandoned him entirely, leaving his mouth feeling stuffed with cotton and regret. Each breath scraped through passages that felt lined with sand, and the simple act of existing had become exhausting labor. The temptation to simply lie down whispered to him, with increasing persuasion. The sand looked soft from this height, promising relief from the burden of carrying his own weight. Sleep beckoned like an old friend, offering to transform suffering into peaceful forgetting. His knees wanted to buckle, his neck wanted to lower, his entire frame wanted to surrender to gravity's patient insistence. Yet something deeper than bone and muscle refused the invitation to quit. Perhaps it was the ghost memory of his rider's face in those final moments. The way courage had flickered in dying eyes, like a candle refusing to be extinguished by wind. That young soldier had never surrendered. Not to enemy fire, not to fear, not even to the bullet that claimed his life. His final act had been to maintain his seat, to continue guiding Kahar through chaos even as his own light faded. Or perhaps it was something more fundamental. A nobility woven into the very architecture of his spirit, that war had battered, but never broken. Horses were creatures of flight, built for endurance, designed by nature to outlast predators through sheer persistence. That ancient programming still pulsed in his blood. Older than human partnership, deeper than learned behavior. Each step became a conversation between despair and determination. His body argued for rest with compelling evidence of its limitations. His spirit countered with memories of morning pastures, of the simple pleasure of movement for its own sake, of the dignity found in refusing to be conquered by circumstance. The desert watched this internal battle with the patience of something that had witnessed countless such struggles. Sand had covered the bones of creatures who had chosen surrender, but it had also been crossed by those who simply refused to stop moving forward. The choice belonged entirely to Kahar, as personal and profound as prayer. He lifted one hoof, then another, not from hope, but from something more sustainable than hope. From the understanding that some battles are won not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated weight of small refusals to give up. Each step was both victory and preparation for the next victory. A testament to the mysterious force that keeps creatures moving toward tomorrow even when today offers nothing but suffering. The sand continued to shift beneath him, but Kahar continued to shift with it, carrying forward something unbreakable, disguised as a broken horse. Sometimes salvation announces itself, not with fanfare, but with the faintest whisper that might be imagination, yet carries within it the power to resurrect hope from the very grave where despair had laid it to rest. Kahar stood motionless in the endless sea of sand, his body swaying like a reed in wind that existed more in memory than reality. His legs had begun the delicate negotiation with collapse, each muscle fiber engaged in quiet rebellion against the weight of continuing. The sun pressed down with the persistence of judgment, and his shadow had shrunk to a small dark pool beneath his hooves, as if even it sought to abandon him. Then, threading through the profound silence like a silver needle through fabric, came a sound that stopped his heart mid-beat. Water. The gentle conversation of liquid moving over stone, so faint it lived at the very edge of perception, yet unmistakably real. It whispered from beyond a ridge of dunes that rose like sleeping giants against the horizon, distant enough to be mirage, clear enough to be miracle. His ears, trained by years of battlefield survival to distinguish between hope and reality, swiveled forward, with the precision of instruments tuned to detect life itself. The sound came again, patient and persistent, neither demanding attention nor apologizing for its subtlety. It simply existed, like truth, waiting to be discovered, rather than proclaimed. Every rational part of his consciousness argued against belief. The desert had already shown him its cruelest tricks, had offered salvation in the form of an empty well, had whispered promises in the language of mirages that dissolved at approach. His body barely possessed the strength to stand, much less to climb the mountainous dunes that separated him from this phantom symphony. Yet something deeper than logic stirred in his chest, something that recognized the authentic voice of water, the way a musician recognizes the pure note among discord. This sound carried none of the hollow echoes of imagination, none of the desperate quality of hallucination. It moved with the patient rhythm of something that had flowed long before his arrival, and would continue long after his passing. His body trembled as he lifted his first hoof toward the distant ridge, the movement requiring negotiation with every fiber of muscle and will. Each step became an act of faith, a conversation between the crushing weight of physical limitation and the persistent whisper of possibility that called from beyond the sand. His breathing came in labored gasps, but beneath the struggle, he felt the faint stirring of something he had thought lost forever. The ridge seemed to retreat with his approach, growing taller and more imposing. As he climbed, the sand shifting treacherously beneath hooves that had once been sure, yet the sound of water grew clearer with each agonizing step, gaining substance and texture, revealing the complex harmony of liquid finding its way through stone passages worn smooth by patient centuries. This could be his final gamble, the last expenditure of strength that would either deliver salvation or witness the gentle conclusion of his desert pilgrimage. But as he climbed toward that distant music, Kahar understood that some risks carry within them their own justification, that the very act of moving toward hope transforms the seeker regardless of what waits beyond the next rise. The water sang its ancient song, and he answered with the rhythm of hooves against sand, two melodies converging across the vast emptiness towards something that might finally resemble home. Some miracles revealed themselves, not as explosions of light, but as quiet gatherings of green against impossible odds. As the brown stallion discovered, when the final dune fell away to unveil a secret the desert had been keeping close to its ancient heart. The oasis spread before Kahar, like a vision materialized from every prayer his parched soul had whispered into the wind. Date palms rose like gentle guardians, their fronds creating pools of blessed shade that danced with the movement of air that actually carried moisture rather than heat. Between their trunks, grass grew in tender patches, each blade a small rebellion against the tyranny of sand and stone. At the center of this impossible sanctuary, water bubbled from deep earth with the persistence of something that had waited eternally for this moment of discovery. The spring moved with unhurried confidence, creating tiny pools that caught sunlight and transformed it into liquid diamonds. The sound that had called him across the wasteland revealed itself as symphony, each note a conversation between water and stone that had been playing since before memory began. Kahar's legs gave way not from exhaustion now, but from the overwhelming weight of salvation. Recognized, he collapsed to his knees at the spring's edge, his reflection wavering in the clear surface like a ghost trying to remember how to be substantial. For a moment, he simply stared, afraid that movement might shatter this vision back into the cruel mathematics of mirage. When he finally lowered his muzzle to drink, the water moved through him like forgiveness made liquid. It flowed past his swollen tongue, down his parched throat, spreading through his body with the patience of healing that understood its own sacred timing. Each swallow carried more than moisture. It carried the possibility of tomorrow, the promise that survival could transform into something approaching peace. The cool liquid seemed to awaken sleeping parts of himself, regions of spirit that had gone dormant during the brutal passage through emptiness. As he drank, he felt the tight knots of despair beginning to loosen, felt his breathing deepen into rhythms that remembered contentment rather than mere endurance. Around the spring's perimeter, other survivors had gathered in the democracy of shared refuge. A desert fox watched him with eyes that held both weariness and welcome. Recognizing in him the universal exhaustion of the successfully tested, lizards sunned themselves on warm stones, with the confidence of creatures who had found their place in the world's equation. Even the insects here moved with purpose rather than desperation, part of an ecosystem that thrived through mutual acceptance of each other's presence. Here, in this pocket of abundance carved from scarcity, Kahar began to understand that healing was not about forgetting the journey, but about integrating its lessons into something sustainable. The scars that mapped his body caught the dappled light filtering through palm fronds, transformed from marks of suffering into evidence of endurance. They told the story of how he had arrived at this moment, each line a chapter in the narrative that had delivered him to grace. The oasis existed as sanctuary, not because it was untouched by the desert's harshness, but because it had learned to create abundance within that harshness. The palms had driven deep roots to find water. The grass had adapted to thrive in patches rather than meadows. The spring itself had carved its path through solid rock with nothing but persistent gentleness. As afternoon dissolved into the golden patience of desert evening, Kahar settled beside the spring with the first contentment he had known since his rider's hand had gone still on the reins. The water continued its ancient song, and he began to harmonize with something deeper than sound, something that felt surprisingly like the beginning of home. Transformation completes itself, not with fanfare, but in the quiet accumulation of countless small victories, as the brown stallion discovered when he woke one morning to find that survival had somehow evolved into something approaching sovereignty over his own carefully claimed corner of the world. Months had passed since Kahar first collapsed beside the spring, and the desert had worked its patient alchemy upon him. His coat had regained the rich luster of polished wood, no longer dulled by the accumulated dust of desperation, but gleaming with the health that comes from consistent nourishment and rest. The white blaze down his face had become a banner of resilience rather than merely identifying mark, catching the early light with the confidence of something that had learned its own worth. The scars that mapped his body had softened from angry reminders into gentle stories, each mark now speaking of endurance rather than damage. They caught shadows and light in ways that suggested depth rather than deficit, proof that healing doesn't require erasure, but integration. His eyes, once hollow with the exhaustion of pure survival, now held something deeper, a wisdom earned through the curriculum of suffering and graduated into understanding. The oasis had become more than sanctuary. It had transformed into domain. Kahar moved through the palm groves with the authority of one who had claimed space not through conquest but through patient stewardship. He knew every stone around the spring, every shift in the wind that announced the approach of weather, every sound that distinguished friend from threat in the desert's complex vocabulary. Other lost souls found their way to his refuge with the persistence of streams finding the sea. Sometimes they arrived as animals, desert foxes limping on wounded paws, birds with broken wings seeking shelter among the palms. Sometimes they came as humans, travelers who had misjudged the desert's patience, or wanderers whose own wars had driven them toward emptiness in search of something they couldn't name. The Kahar had become more than survivor in these encounters. He had evolved into guide. Something in his presence communicated the possibility of moving from despair toward hope, not through denial of suffering, but through integration of its lessons. He understood the journey because he had walked every step of it himself, had felt the weight of abandonment transform gradually into the freedom of self-determination. Dawn found him standing at the oasis's edge, no longer the creature who had fled from battle, but something entirely new, neither fully domesticated nor completely wild. He had carved out a third option, a way of being that honored both his history and his choice to transcend it. The morning light painted his coat in shades of amber and gold, and his breath formed small clouds in the cool air that spoke of life continuing, of stories still being written. The horizon that had once promised only emptiness now suggested infinite possibility. Behind him, the spring continued its ancient song, and around him, the community of survivors went about their daily negotiations with existence. He was no longer running from anything but standing firmly in a present he had earned through the simple persistence of refusing to surrender. If you found inspiration in Kahar's journey from desperation to dignity, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of unexpected resilience and transformation. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.